Hello everyone. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video than probably some of my other book reviews. There's just a lot to get through in this book. It's not a long book, but there was a lot of information in it. So this is Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, written by Jason Schreier. After reading this book, I had like a huge change in the way I look at the way games are developed. The amount of time that's spent making these games and the amount of shit that developers have to go through while they're making them just seems absolutely unreal to me. And also, the fact that no two games are really made the same way, that's something that Jason brings up early on. It's really fascinating to me, it's fascinating and it makes some sense. Because if you look at it, with all the different publishers out there, they all have different techniques and different ways to do the same thing. And they all have different tools that will accomplish a similar task. But sometimes those tools can be a little bit dated. New technology can come out which forces people to change their engine entirely, or change the different applications they're using with certain tools that they're using. It sounds like an incredibly chaotic thing that just, my god, I don't even know how the hell some of these games are made anymore. A few of them you can look at a game and go, okay, I kind of understand how they're doing that. I can see how the platformers are put together. But when I look at a modern sort of open world action RPG, sometimes I'm like, oh my god, how the hell did they do this? It's just really amazing when you look at them. And in this book, Jason did a lot of interviews with several different game publishers. I think he covers about 7 or 8 games that are developed between, the dates are a little screwy, but it's kind of between 2009, when they started some of their conceptions with a few of these games, and all the way up till about 2015, 2016. So some of these games take a ridiculously long time. Some of them get rushed out just because the parent companies are like, no, we need to make our quarterly earnings, we don't really care about it seems like sometimes they're like, we don't really care about your deadlines, we just want the game that we asked for out, and we want it out now. So they go into what the phrase that I'm becoming more and more familiar with as I read more of these books, with crunch mode, where they're working 20-hour days, and they just sleep in the office, and their lives just suck for a period of time. But before all of that, Jason talks a little bit about game development. And there's one quote that was really interesting to me that was brought up. How long does it take to make fun? And that was something I never really thought about before, because, for me, you pop in a legend, and this is going to be very personalized towards me, but I pop in a Legend of Zelda game, I know what it's going to be, and I know I have a long track record with Zelda, so I know it's going to be fun. If it's not fun, that's a huge shock to me. It's kind of like you put in a Mario game, you know what you're going to expect with Mario. You put in a Final Fantasy game, normally you know what to expect. They've gone a little bit crazy recently, but yeah, but whatever. If you put in an Atlas game, you know it's going to be a JRPG that's a little bit weird. And it's just, some developers, you know exactly what you're going to get. So you know that so you as the player know that it's already going to be fun, or there's going to be some element of fun. But sometimes you don't really know that. So when people first played Crash Bandicoot, they probably didn't necessarily know it was going to be fun. Or when you first experienced The Last of Us, you might not have known it was going to be fun, or you might not have known the story was going to be the way it was. Yeah, it's crazy the way that I never really thought about that before, and then when I started reading this book, I was like, how do these developers decide what is fun and what is not fun, and how do you go into a game and create fun out of something that is sort of abstract at that moment? And just the fact that they could spend months developing something, put it into sort of the framework of their game, and then play it with the rest of the game and realize, wow, those months that I spent making this thing were a total waste of time, and none of this is actually fun, so we have to throw out these months of work and redo and that just like boggled my mind. I was like, oh my god, I never really thought about that sort of thing. But, you know, it's just one of these things as as the player, I don't really think about too much. As a game developer, if I actually still was like trying to make games, I would be like, oh yeah, that's right, that's exactly how it's done. I should mention, like, I did try my hand at game developing once. This was like way back in high school, and the game I put together was absolutely atrocious. If you guys want to hear more about that, I can put that into its own video because it doesn't really belong here. But yeah, it's really crazy. Like, I never thought about those things. So like he goes through several different games. The first one, he was talking about a JRPG that was sort of abandoned by Microsoft called Stormlands, and this was supposed to be made by the same people that did Pillars of Eternity. Well, I swear English is my first language, guys. But Pillars of Eternity is made by Obsidian, and Obsidian took some of what they were doing with Stormlands. They couldn't take everything, because Stormlands was supposed to be like a first-person perspective JRPG in the same mold of like Skyrim and like Fallout 4, that sort of thing. Now, personally, this is just me talking again, I absolutely hate first-person perspectives. They just absolutely drive me insane, especially for an RPG, but I can definitely see how a lot of people would like them, because it gives you a better idea of like you being in the game, but for me it's just like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. So, yeah. So Stormlands gets canceled, and Obsidian was like, okay, well now what do we do? So they decided to do something a little bit odd, which I didn't think about at the time, but they decided to create their own IP, which in game development apparently is a sort of a gamble, because you don't know if the public is actually going to want to buy that IP or not. If you sell them a Metroid game, or a game within like the Metroid family, or not really Metroid family, a game that's like inspired by Metroid, people generally know what they're going to get. If you sell them like a game called Dune, you sell them Doom, people know what the heck Doom is. If you sell them Halo, they know what Halo is. But if you create a new game, then people don't necessarily have a track record with it. So that was kind of a gamble for Obsidian. So Obsidian, and this is the first one that they talk about in here, Obsidian started using Kickstarter, which Kickstarter games have kind of a hit and miss track record, to be honest with you. Some of them turn out great, some of them are pretty disappointing, and a few of them feel like they're absolute scams because they never get off the ground, and you sometimes don't necessarily get your money back. But the Pillars of Eternity people did a Kickstarter, and it was actually successful, but they ran into a problem with some of their stretch goals, because they said they were going to add in another city. And then they hit the stretch goal for that other city, and they realized this other city doesn't really fit with our story, but we promised it, so we're going to put it in anyway. And again, I haven't played this, I'm just going off what was in the book, but they sort of, like, I got the impression from reading what the development team was saying to Jason that the second city didn't really feel like it belonged in the game, but because of the stretch goals and the promises they made through Kickstarter, they put it in anyway. Which, one, good for Obsidian to actually follow up on some of the promises they made for their game. I mean, sometimes that doesn't necessarily happen, and sometimes you don't exactly get told why it didn't happen. But that was really interesting to read about that. Yeah, it was just crazy reading about that, because they had to go back and like reinvent some of the stuff that they were doing, because they wanted it to look more in the mold of an RPG that was put out like a Baldur's Gate RPG or something earlier on in the 2000s, but they wanted it to also look kind of more modern as well. And again, I haven't played this game, so I'm going off of what was said in here. So yeah, the next game that they looked at They go over the development of Far Cry 4, I believe. Yeah, Far Cry 4. And this one was a little bit different because, or sorry, not Far Cry, Uncharted 4. Wow, okay. Oh man, it is way too early for me to be doing this, and I'm not caffeinated. But, oh well. So just going through like Naughty Dog's development of this, and it was amazing that they had a story, they were moving along, and all of a sudden something happened where they weren't happy with the direction of the game, so they brought in the two people that had worked on several of the other Uncharted's and also created Last of Us, and they were like, hey, we need you to do Uncharted 4. And these guys were actually hoping for a break before they did that, so they had to like go in and rework the story for Uncharted. And if you've ever written anything, or if you've ever, watched like some of the movie productions, and I might compare this to movies a little bit because it's sort of similar, where all of a sudden like the studio moves in and is like, hey, we don't like this part of the story, you need to cut it out. That's really crazy that happened, and just the fact that they were able to still get it done and have it look good and everything, it's really crazy about that. This is another game that I've never played. I've never played any of the Uncharted's. I haven't even played The Last of Us. I have it, I just haven't played it yet. But let's move on. The third game, this is a game I have played and I absolutely love, and I didn't know the story behind it until I read this. But the third game he looks at is Stardew Valley, and oh my god, the way that this game was made just blows my mind. Because when I look at it, it definitely looks like an indie game because it really resembles sort of like a cleaned up version of Harvest Moon. And that was kind of what the guy was going for when he put this whole thing together. And he put it together over the course of like several years, and I felt so bad for him. Because he was like, I felt horrible, I felt like an absolute loser because I was working like part-time at a movie theater while I was coding this game. I was like, oh my god, dude, I mean, looking back at it now, I was like, oh my god, if any of those people like remember you now, they might, they'll look at you very differently now. But it's so horrible that that's the way you felt, because like he was just trying to make rent for this like apartment that him and his wife were living in. So he was like, well, this game's not bringing in anything since it's not done yet, so I need to go get a part-time job at like a movie theater to help pay for this game. And he's constantly giving updates on like what the game was doing. He didn't want to put it out into early access because he was like, the game's not finished, so I don't want to do that. He had to figure out how to actually get the game released, which is something I never thought about. But when you're doing an indie game, if you're doing an indie game and you have no track record in the game industry, yeah, you might have to figure some of that stuff out. Because this guy started working on this game like right around the time he graduated college, and he'd never worked in the game industry. Some of the, like, I think one or two of the other indie games that are made in this, or that Jason talks about, they at least were made by people who had been in the game industry for a few years. This is this guy's very first game. He never worked in the industry, and he didn't really know what he was doing, so he had to like watch a lot of YouTube videos. He watched a lot of other things to learn how to put this game together, and it looks absolutely amazing when you look at it now. And just to think that it took him so long to get it done, and he did at least if you read this book, I have no idea if I have no reason to think that it's not true, but he spent so much time on his own working on this game, like so many hours doing it. The amount that he was able to achieve is absolutely amazing. It was just so cool to read about this whole thing. But I never really knew about like the isolation that you feel when you're developing these games, because you're making them in like an absolute vacuum and everything. And honestly, like, I just felt so bad for this guy, and I really felt bad for a lot of the developers in this, because I was like, the hell you go through to put these games together, and if they're bad, you just get absolutely shit on. And it's like, oh my god, dude, I mean, I understand if you make a bad game, you deserve criticism, but holy crap, man, this is just insane. Um, the next one, I've played the previous games in this series, but I'd never played this one. It was Diablo 3 was the next game you looked at. And I only remember hearing about a lot of the criticisms of Diablo 3, where they had all of these like server errors, so people couldn't really get online to play, which like I don't understand why games that don't necessarily need to be online demand that you be online the entire time. Excuse me. But Diablo 3 was apparently one of those to begin with. And just from like reading the online criticism alone, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do this game. But reading about how the development team like went after fixing the problems that they had, I was sort of like, okay, at least you acknowledge that there was a problem and you tried to fix it. You weren't just like, no, this was the way the game is. If you guys don't like it, then go to hell. But this was, I'm just going to be honest here, this was an actual good developer. This was Blizzard. They actually know what they're doing, and they most of the time care about the people that are buying the games. They're not like some development companies. I'm not going to mention EA's name, but it was definitely EA that really doesn't give a shit about the player whatsoever. And I think they know they don't give a shit about the player, but at least Blizzard here did, and they actually tried to like fix the problems. And they changed it from something that was like borderline play to win to something that would actually be fun to play and not, you know, a major pain in the ass. I'm not going to talk too much more about it because I think I think Diablo 3 has been kind of talked about to death at this point. But it really remembers, like, it doesn't remember, but it really reminds me of kind of like how Sega and like, kind of how Sega will put out a shitty Sonic game now. And that kind of felt like how Diablo 3 was in its first incarnation, just from reading this. I got the impression that this was like, Blizzard put out a crap game and everybody was like, oh my god, how the hell could they put out a crap game? Because it was Blizzard and they didn't really do that. I can't really think, and even Diablo 3 probably wasn't really bad, it was just, the way it was bad compared to some of the other Blizzard games that have been out. It's always amazing when you see a game developer that puts out a game that's like, it's still good, but it's not like up to par with all of their other games. But yeah. The next one they talk about is a game I had never heard of and I never played before, but I know the game developer because the game developer did Age of Empires. The next one was Halo Wars that was done by Ensemble, which isn't around anymore, unfortunately, because of Halo Wars. And this was something I never thought about before. Halo Wars was a game that Ensemble didn't even want to make. They wanted to make a totally different game, and then they went to Microsoft, and Microsoft said, you know what would be great is if you made that Halo-themed. And Ensemble, because they were a subsidiary of Microsoft, they were like, well shit, now we have to make it Halo-themed. And they kind of didn't want to keep making strategy games. They wanted to make something else, and they were like trying to get 3 projects at the same time going. One of them happened to be Halo Wars. And just like this story is absolutely insane. It was like the company didn't want to make the game, so they were working on it, but they were not really working on it because it was a console strategy game, like a console real-time strategy game, which if you've ever tried to play one of the console real-time strategy games, you know you need a mouse. That's just to put it that way. It really feels like you need a mouse to play a real-time strategy game. And most consoles don't have that, and the ones that do have a mouse, for some godforsaken reason, the mouse wasn't compatible with the real-time strategy games that came out for it. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, there is a version of Dune 2. It's not called Dune 2, but it is Dune 2 for the Sega Genesis, and it's not compatible with the Sega mouse. So you have to play it with a frickin' D-pad and basically with your controller. And a D-pad to move around on that is just incredibly frickin' annoying. But apparently they came up with a really good control scheme that they felt good about with their real-time strategy game. And the problem was the studio just never bought into wanting to work on the game. So finally, when it came close to the game getting pushed out, Microsoft said, "This is the last game you guys are going to make because we're going to we're shutting down your studio after you're done with it." And it just must have been like a major gut punch for those guys because I mean, you're stuck making a game for Microsoft that you don't want to make, and then Microsoft says, "Well, because you don't really want to make the game, fuck you, you're done." And they put the game out, and then they got shut down, and some of their employees ended up getting a job at another studio, but they weren't sure who was getting a job, and the entire work environment just sounded incredibly shitty. But yeah, that's actually one of the games I probably won't go to, just simply because it's on Xbox, and in all honesty, I don't really care about Xbox that much. The next game is Dragon Age Inquisition. I've never played any of the Dragon Age games, but this is another one that took a long time to get done, and it was almost like the company was trying to make up for the fact that I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to have to go on an EA rant, but EA fucked them on the second game, because they wanted to get it out quickly. They even changed the goddamn name from I can't remember what it was, and I didn't write down what they were going to call it, but they weren't going to call it Dragon Age 2, they were going to call it something else, and EA was like, no, just call it Dragon Age 2, because, EA has all the creativity of Dust Bunny, but whatever. This is a game I actually might want to go and play, because it sounds really amazing just from the way that they're playing it. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. It was just, this was a case of a developer trying to make up for the fact that they made a game that was not up to their standards with Dragon Age 2. And I could be misreading it, but that was kind of the way that I got from that chapter. It sounds like from what I'm hearing, they did. And this game fell into one of the traps that a lot of the games in here, at least a lot of the big party titles had, where they were caught in between generations, where they had to make the game good enough to look good on the PS4 or the Xbox One, but they couldn't make it look too good because it still had to come out on the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And so when you're reading this, you see a lot of well, not a lot, but you do see them debate whether or not they should just abandon the previous generation and just go with the new ones, because we can still support the old the PS3 and the Xbox 360 and nobody was supporting the Wii U, but we can still support those, but they're kind of on their last legs, so what would be the point of us doing that when we can just move on to the new consoles? Which they weren't really sure if the new consoles were going to be a success or not, which is something that I never really thought about, because, back when honestly, I never really looked at this news, to be perfectly honest, but if you were when you went from NES to Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, particularly when you went to Super Nintendo, you're like, well, they've already got a fan base, of course it's going to be successful, why wouldn't it be? And then you realize that there's a huge drop-off, especially if the company fucks over its customers. For example, going from the Sega Genesis to the Sega Saturn, Sega's fan base evaporated, because Sega had just been screwing with them the whole time, with the Sega CD and then the 32X, and then not even a year later the Sega Saturn comes out after the 32X, so the 32X just felt like a money grab to customers and everything. And this is coming from a guy that I actually knew somebody who bought the 32X, and we played 2 games on it and then never went back to the stupid thing ever again because there just wasn't anything there. But yeah, that was just crazy to hear about that and just to get that sort of perspective. Yeah, the next one they talk about is Shovel Knight, which is another successful Kickstarter game. I think everybody knows about Shovel Knight. There's nothing I can really add on to it. Oh, then he talks about Destiny, which is another, like, it's a game that I never played and I never paid any attention to because, in all honesty, it came from Bungie, and Bungie's like the Halo company, and I'm not a huge fan of Halo. I played the first one, played the second one, and then didn't give a shit about any of the other ones because they were all on Xbox, and I didn't play Xbox. And then they came out with Destiny, and I'm sorry, like, I wasn't paying any attention to Destiny because I really didn't care. But the way that they went about making that story is incredibly fascinating because they were making the game and then nobody knew what the story of the game was going to be. So, like, that just doesn't make any, like, as a writer, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why the hell would you make something and not have a vague idea of where the story's going? Now, the story can change as you're doing this, and that's perfectly fine. But how the hell can you just, like, make a game and get to, I think they were like a year out or like a year and a half out, and nobody making the game had any idea what the hell the story was. And then when they released the story to the team, everybody was like, Jesus Christ, this is crap. So with it, like, I think it was like about a year and a half or so, they totally redid the entire story, which totally fucked over the pacing of the game in every way. So when you change the overall story of the game, and I'll skip ahead a few to go into another game that did this as well that he talks about. But when you totally revamp the entire story, it's like, okay, so now we've got artwork and levels for this place in the world, but now there's no reason why they're there. So, for example, like, why the hell are they on Mars now when there's no reason for them to be on Mars in the story? So we need to move this section, which was supposed to be like level 2 to like level 7, and we need to stitch everything back together to have it make sense. And it just sounds like it was an absolutely horrible way to make a game, but, you know, they did it. And you hear throughout the, well, you don't really hear, you read throughout the entire story how, like, the core members of Bungie were just, like, leaving left and right because they were so unhappy with the game. A lot of them didn't want to make another first-person shooter, kind of like how Ensemble didn't want to make another real-time strategy. But they were already committed to doing it, and it was just like, oh my god, really? But yeah, that was just a crazy, crazy story, and, like, when I was reading it, it just didn't make any sense when I was reading it, because I was like, how the hell do you do this to a team? Yeah, but whatever. It's just a fascinating, fascinating story. So I'm going to skip ahead. He talks about Witcher 3. Witcher 3 had a lot of the same problems where they're like, do we put it out on PS3, Xbox 360, and we have to also make this game, like, very grand in scale and everything, so they talk about that. And that, honestly, that the development of that game, it went smoother than a lot of the other developments going on here. It was still incredibly chaotic, but it sounded less chaotic than some of the other ones, because at least the company wanted to make the goddamn game. But yeah, it was just so crazy reading this. Ah, yes, here we are. The last game he talks about is Star Wars 1313. I had never honestly heard about this game because to be perfectly honest, I was living in a hole somewhere, so I don't really pay attention to E3 that much because I'm not into, like, game journalism too much. If a game came out, like, before 2015, I was just sort of like, oh, cool, let me see how this works, I'll try this out. But yeah, this was something I didn't really hear about, but it is absolutely amazing, and it just solidifies why I think George Lucas sucks. Because, my god, like, what he did to this game to LucasArts when they was making this game, I was like, Jesus Christ, dude, what is wrong with you? So, the main thing, I just want to cut right to the part which drives me absolutely insane. They had this entire game made up, like, laid out and everything. They had, like, their voice actor already recording lines for, like, their main character. Everything was all set up to be, like, its own totally unique thing. and then they pitched the game to George Lucas, or George Lucas came into the room and he said, hey, you know what would be great? Change the main character to Boba Fett. Which totally fucks the story over, because all of a sudden you now have to change the actor who's doing the voice settings. You have to totally redo the story to make it more canon with what Boba Fett would do. And the game developers were kind of like, you don't seem to understand that we can't just change the main character on our story and everything. But apparently it was George Lucas's company, and he was just like, nope, this is what we're doing. And then during the course of the entire development, Lucasfilms, which owned LucasArts, got bought by Disney, and Disney basically said, you know what, we don't care about this game. We're just going to scrap it, and we're going to turn all of the intellectual property rights over to EA, and EA is going to fuck it up. They didn't know that at the time, but it's EA. That's kind of what they do. They make shit that they think people are going to want to play, and yeah, whatever. I'm not going to jump up on another soapbox about EA again. I could, but nobody really wants me to do that. Anyway, it was just so amazing to hear about this, and like the different ideas that they were passing around to make this Star Wars 1313, where they were like, we can make it like Grand Theft Auto, because honestly that would be absolutely amazing for a Star Wars game, but you know, they didn't want to do that. They wanted to go like something a little bit different, like Far Cry and Uncharted, which also would have been pretty cool as well. But yeah, that's pretty much where the book ends. It just, my final thoughts on it, it's just like, holy shit, I never even realized the amount of crap that game developers have to go through just to put out a product that they're pretty sure people are gonna like. And sometimes they find out, no, they don't like it at all, or it's just not what the fans really thought it was going to be, or it gets overhyped or something like that. But it's just absolutely amazing to me when I read stories about how these games are made, because just as just the simple like player, I don't think about that. I just think, oh great, I got my disc or I got my cartridge, I'm gonna put it into my system and it's gonna fire up and I'm gonna have fun for several hours at a sitting. And just reading this, I kind of have like a renewed perspective on like how these games are put together, and I'm honestly gonna call far fewer games trash unless they really are. I really think that this is a great book, and honestly, if you can get a copy of it, or if there is an e-copy, I didn't even see if there is an e-copy of it, because I'm weird and I like to have the actual physical book. If you could find this, I really encourage you to read it if you're either a developer, if you want to get into development, or if you're just a gamer and you want to know more about the industry. This is a great book to read. I can't really say, there's not really much more I can say about it, because it's just, it's really good, and it just, you know, it's one of those things that you have to read in order to really enjoy. But yeah, if you guys like the video, if you have another book you want me to read, or if you liked the video or hated the video, just let me know in the comments below. Have a good night, everybody.